speakers. I suggest we stay in the room. We'll move on to these high-power sites. We'll look at the strategic challenges. We have a unique structure for testing floating wind farms, 10 to 25 megawatts. Thank you for being with us. You are the director of the site at the Foundation, which was created in March 2023. It manages all these test sites in France. We're talking, of course, about floating wind farms and others kinds of projects. We have to look at the regulatory issue to facilitate life. The idea is to focus on development and to speed up the marketing and the obtaining of patents. Hello, can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you, Izan, CROM, very well. Thank you for coming to Montpellier to talk about this future site, which is a very powerful one. What is a high-power site compared with a pilot site? Before I talk specifically about these high-power sites, I'd like to talk about test sites in general. A test site is an infrastructure linked to the network, to the grid. It has a budget to test innovations which can be very varied in nature. The goal, in general, is to speed up the implementation of new technologies and to save time for industry and academia who has research projects or development projects. Our purpose is to help them to save time and money by pooling the costs of linking to the grid, costs linked to the site, and enable them to benefit from a lot of feedback. A test site is a vector for acceleration in the energy transition. That's why this is managed by the Foundation, the OpenSea Foundation. Similarly, the idea is to raise awareness and spread the information. One of the missions of the OpenSea Foundation is to share the knowledge acquired amongst all those in the area so the various stakeholders can benefit and position themselves vis-à-vis new technologies. It's a potential for making the acceptance of these new technologies more widespread. We don't focus on the technology, the industrial secrets, because that belongs to industry. What we focus on is cross-cutting themes. For example, the environment impact of these technologies. So today, there are 5 or 6 test sites. There will be a 6th one in the future. It will be a test site which will be dedicated to floating wind farms. Yes, we have several test sites which can welcome floating wind farms. We're currently doing a feasibility study to imagine a new facility dedicated to high-power floating wind farms. We're currently studying the feasibility. What we know, in fact, is, we talked about it earlier on with the various players, floating wind farms will be indispensable to meet the decarbonation goals set by the various members of the European Union. We need floating wind farms, and they can be competitive. There are several ways of moving forward. Volume, energy efficiency, an increase in the size of the turbines will underpin efficiency. I don't know whether you all know, but it seems quite self-evident. To be more efficient, a floating wind farm needs to have ever bigger turbines. And in fact, these floating wind farms will be unheard of. They've never been tested, built, developed. The OpenSea Foundation has tried to take a stance in this area. It explains that we will have to conduct tests to better understand. So the very high power site, well, the origin of the idea is to meet this future need. So this future high power site, how will it reduce risk in commercial projects? How will it serve the needs of industry? We talked about this earlier on. Well, that's what indeed is at stake. The idea is, first of all, to reassure investors and insurers. Typically, a technology that hasn't been tested at sea is considered to be a prototype so long as it hasn't been operational for 1 year at sea. In other words, in our vision of things at the Open Sea Foundation, we think it could be strategic to prove the worth of a technology in order to reassure, convince, and perhaps adapt the technology based on real-time conditions. And in the end, this will make it possible to reduce the insurance premiums, these excess premiums, which are linked to the uncertainty during the first year of operation. That's the first point, which is fairly essential. Today, the Open Sea Foundation is gathering various letters of support to bear us out in our stance. We have a lot of industries. Some people think on the contrary. Some people have different views, but others support us in public. We were involved in the wind energy trade fair in September. Two members of industry were able to take the floor, XR which has an innovative technology, and the developer of RWR technologies. They took the floor to explain that this was part of their vision, it was part of their strategy, and it was one of the paths for technological development. So it's quite interesting and worthwhile to move in this direction. That's the first point I wanted to mention. The idea is, therefore, to reduce risk. Second point, this high-power site will be a facility for tests for everyone involved in this value chain. It won't just be a standards test site. This will enable French industry to position itself and benefit from a first feedback on concrete cases in order to learn how to size the tools which will have to be developed. We were talking about an automated chain, for example, is a concrete case in terms of sizing the tools in the equipment. Train people in the maintenance, management of all these farms which will be installed in the future. So we believe that this is an indispensable point for this line of activity. It's essential for all those involved. And perhaps one last point very quickly. We think that in terms of reducing risk and acceptance, we believe that these tests are of paramount importance. It's a possibility for raising awareness, disseminating information about feedback. We can better understand what's happening, identify possible impacts. So we believe that this is a key tool. One last point very quickly. We learned an important lesson from the public debate held some time ago. There are a lot of questions which haven't yet been answered. We believe that a test site is a good way to provide answers to a number of outstanding questions. So when will this high-power site come into existence? If we manage to build it in France, of course there's an international need recognized by a large number of other countries, and if it's built in France, we believe that it could be operational by 2030, 2031. Of course, providing we get the relevant authorization and financing, which is not an easy matter. But we should be able to aim at the coming into service in 2030 or 31 of the first French test farm. We have a test currently underway, financed by the French state. It's supported by ADEME. This feasibility study began over a year ago now, and it should come to a close in the middle of 2025. And then we would enter the implementation phase for detailed studies on this new facility if the results of the feasibility study are good. So So now we know when. Where will it be located? Well, where? We haven't really decided yet. To define the final location of this new facility, you have to meet several criteria: technical, depth, distance from the coast, minimal and maximum distance, and needs of the users. There are a number of technical criteria: acceptance, visibility, environmental impact, impact on uses, that is, other commercial wind farms near the area which is of interest to us. So we have to look into all these criteria, and we haven't chosen the exact place yet. However, there are two geographic areas which have been selected and identified. Our board, Open Sea, discussed the matter. These zones are just off South Brittany, near AO5. That's a really interesting area. And an area off Occitania. That's part of Zone 1 off Narbonne. These are the two areas we're looking at for deploying this new infrastructure. In these two areas, we're currently looking at two kinds of links to the grid. A link which could be direct, similar to what was done in the pilot areas. You look for the RTE grid on Earth, and then the link could be pooled. It would be a link which would include the RTA grid at sea via the electrical equipment already installed. RTE has planned for pooling these uses when designing their electricity facilities at sea. So that will accommodate a very high power site. What's worthwhile with this latter solution is that the investment cost would be reduced. It's a huge advantage, and we could roll out a new activity in an environment dedicated to floating wind farms with logistical means that have already been sized for commercial activity, and this large power site could benefit from all this. Well, thank you very much. If you have any questions on this future high-power test site, don't hesitate. It's now or never, so don't hesitate. There's a microphone available. We have a question. Raise your hand, please. Here, you can have a microphone and introduce yourself, please.
From BMT in London. We do structural monitoring and design CTVs and things like that. I had a question with regards to these sites, whether you would be open sourcing the information with industry in terms of the results or things like the integrity of the mooring systems and the data that comes from that. Because it's been an area where there's been test projects in the past where this has been a problem area because it hasn't been considered from the very outset of the engineering.
Thank you. I would have liked to hear the question in English in order to understand the finer detail.
So, if I understood properly, you mean that in the selection of our site, we should consider the information of the soil that is available or not available. Is that right? No. I'm sorry because I can't understand the question.
Bon, je vous proposerai d'échanger ensuite. Désolé, monsieur.
Well, maybe you should swap information together at the end. Are there any other questions? In French and in English.
Alors, je ne vois pas a priori d'autres questions.
I see no other questions. Yes? Right at the opposite end.
On vous apporte le micro. Levez-vous, s'il vous plaît, qu'on vous voit bien. Merci. Bonjour, madame.
Bonjour, Charlotte.
Hello, Charlotte Leroux. For the past 10 years, I've been working in offshore wind farms, designing the floaters. And to react what was said at the previous session, we need to have a European industry to build these floaters and turbines.
Est-ce que le problème, c'est qu'on a aussi des considérations économiques?
Of course, there is the economic side to these projects, which is very important. Do we have the means on test sites to force the European industry that builds these projects? We need to push them into more commercial pricing, for example. And what about Turkey? Is Turkey part of Europe? What are the levers we have to, at least at a test phase, and to ensure that we develop a European industry in this respect? Thank you for your question.
Ce qu'on peut dire, c'est ce que j'ai un peu expliqué au début.
I explained this at the outset. Test sites make it possible to pool costs among several users. What's worthwhile for an industry in a test site is that the person won't pay the full cost of a link to the grid or the use of that link. So you pool these costs. That's something that's built into the notion of a test site, and that's true of all test sites in Europe. They all function basically in the same manner. Today, what we're looking to obtain, I said this quite quickly in my presentation, the need is shared and identified by several players. The various sites have shared the same findings, and we're currently joining together under indices. This project is designed to convey this message to Europe. The idea is to be able to raise financing for the infrastructure itself so it can function at a competitive cost and be attractive for users, and costs for the users similarly, directly in terms of their project, so that things can be financed, these demonstration projects, these pilot projects can be financed more easily. People often talk about the Death Valley time, which is when it's very hard to find financing for such projects. We have grouped together in a number of countries to try and to propose to Europe a coherent vision of these test sites on off various shores, of various coasts. Not have one test site per country, but perhaps one test site per coast. And thus we could convey messages to the European Commission. We could boost the additional requests for financing, the additional calls for tenders at this very difficult financing period for such projects. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming to talk about this future high-power test site. And now we'll move on to the next session. Thank you very much for joining us here today. We can give Izan a great round of applause. We've talked about this equipment.